Try to remember last week. Now try to remember a single ordinary week from when you were 8. You can't, and that's not a memory problem. It's the same reason this year felt shorter than the last, and next year will feel shorter still. There is a mechanism inside your head deciding how long your life feels. And right now, it's working against you. But once you understand how it works, you can actually slow it back down. Most people assume time speeding up is just a feeling, a trick of the mind, something vague that happens to everyone and can't be explained. But that's not quite right. The acceleration you're feeling is real, measurable, and built into the architecture of your brain. And the reason it happens is far stranger than running out of time. You're running out of something else entirely. Let's start with the simplest answer, the one that's been around the longest. In 1897, a French philosopher named Paul Janet proposed an idea so clean it still holds up today. He noticed that we don't measure time against a clock. We measure it against our own lives. To a child of 10, 1 year is an enormous thing. It's a tenth of everything they have ever experienced. It's a tenth of their entire existence. But to a person of 50, that same year is just 1/50th of their life. The year hasn't changed, the clock hasn't changed, but the proportion has collapsed. Each year you live becomes a smaller and smaller slice of the whole. So each year feels shorter than the one before it. This is called the proportional theory, and mathematically, it's brutal. By this logic, the years between 5 and 10 feel just as long as the years between 40 and 80. Half your perceived life is over before you finish high school. But proportion is only part of the story, because it explains the math. It doesn't explain what it actually feels like inside your head. For that, we have to talk about memory. Here is something strange about how your brain keeps time. It doesn't count seconds, it counts memories. When you look back on a period of your life, your brain estimates how long it lasted by how much you remember from it. A week packed with new experiences feels long in hindsight. A week where nothing happened feels like it barely existed. And this changes everything. Think about why childhood felt so vast. When you were young, almost everything was happening for the first time. Your first day of school, the first time you rode a bike, the first time you saw the ocean, the first time you felt embarrassed, the first time you felt brave. Your brain was recording constantly because everything was new and everything mattered. Those years are dense with memory, and dense memory feels like long time. There's even a name for this. Psychologists call it the reminiscence bump. When researchers ask elderly people to recall the most vivid memories of their lives, the memories don't spread out evenly across the decades. They cluster, almost violently, between the ages of 15 and 25. Your first love, leaving home, the friendships that defined you. The decade when everything was happening for the first time produces more lasting memory than all the decades that follow combined. That period feels enormous in hindsight, not because it was longer, but because your brain was paying attention. Now think about your life now. You wake up, you take the same route, you do the same work, you eat familiar food, you scroll the same screens. Your days are efficient, automated, and almost entirely forgettable. Your brain has seen all of it before, so it stops recording. It compresses repetition into nothing. And a year that isn't recorded is a year that vanishes. This is why the neuroscientist David Eagleman, who has spent his career studying how the brain perceives time, found that novel experiences appear to last longer in our memory than routine ones. He even tested it by dropping volunteers into free fall to flood their brains with new sensory information. In those terrifying seconds, time seemed to stretch because the brain was recording at full capacity. The lesson is unsettling. Routine doesn't just make life boring. Routine quite literally erases it. The more familiar your life becomes, the faster it disappears. But there's a deeper layer beneath even this, and it's physical. Your brain doesn't just record fewer memories as you age, it runs slower. In 2019, a Duke University engineer named Bejan published a theory about why. When you're young, your brain processes images at a remarkable speed. Signals travel through fresh, simple, efficient networks. You take in a high number of mental frames every second, the way a camera shooting in slow motion captures more detail. As you age, those neural pathways grow larger and more tangled. The signals have farther to travel and more resistance to fight through, so you process fewer frames per second. And here's the consequence. Because you're capturing fewer mental images in the same amount of real time, the outside world appears to move faster past you. A child experiences more moments inside a single hour than an adult does, even though the clock on the wall is identical. And there's one more piece, a chemical one. Deep in your brain sits a kind of internal clock, and it runs partly on dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical of novelty, reward, and discovery. When you're young, it floods your system constantly, and it makes your internal clock tick faster, which makes external time feel slow and full. But dopamine declines steadily as you age. Studies estimate your brain loses a measurable percentage of its dopamine receptors with every passing decade. And as it fades, your internal clock slows down. The world keeps moving at the same speed, but your sense of it lags further and further behind. So time doesn't actually accelerate, you decelerate. And from the inside, those feel exactly the same. Now put it all together, because this is where it becomes something more than science. Each passing year is a smaller fraction of your life. Your brain records less, because less is new. It processes fewer frames as its wiring ages, and its internal clock slows as the chemistry of youth drains away. It isn't one thing stealing your time. It's everything, working at once, quietly, every single day. Which raises a question that should genuinely disturb you. If your life is measured not in years but in memories, then a person who lives to 90 inside an unchanging routine may experience less actual life than someone who dies at 40, having never stopped seeking the new. Two people, the same 50 years, and one of them barely lived them at all. But here is the part that matters, the part that changes this from a tragedy into an instruction. If routine is what erases time, then novelty is what brings it back. This isn't a metaphor, it's the most practical thing science can offer you. Every time you do something for the first time, your brain switches the recorder back on. A new place, a new skill, a different route home, a conversation with a stranger, a fear you finally face. These are not just nice experiences, they are time itself, physically deposited back into your memory, thickening the years, slowing the blur. The people who feel their lives stretching out in front of them are not the ones avoiding aging. They're the ones refusing to let a single year become a copy of the last. So go back to the beginning. You couldn't remember an ordinary week from when you were 8, and you couldn't remember last week either. But the 8-year-old's blank was caused by a brain so flooded with the new that it couldn't capture all of it. Yours is caused by the opposite, by a life that has quietly stopped surprising you. The clock on your wall has not changed since the day you were born. 1 second has always been 1 second. The acceleration was never in the world. It was always in you. And that means the speed of your life was never something happening to you. It's something you've been doing to yourself. And starting tomorrow, you can do it differently.